everyone. First of all, I feel like it's obligatory to say something about how people, an audience, for a talk on literary vampires or refugees from the sunlight, you know. So, hi, welcome everyone to the Festival of Ideas. I'm Jim Watt from the University of York. I'm chairing this afternoon's session, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you all in person here. Okay, so it's a great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Christopher Frayling. So Christopher Frayling, an award-winning writer and broadcaster, best known as a historian of popular culture, who's written widely on subjects ranging from spaghetti westerns to vampires. He's also written and produced various television series as well. So Christopher's most recent book is the paperback reissue of Vampyres, a literary anthology, published by Thames and Hudson in 2022, and he'll be drawing upon this work for his talk today on the history of vampires in literature. So over to you, Christopher.
Very much. Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? Can you hear me, everybody? Yeah, no, the reason I ask is that I did a radio program recently about the French artist Henri Matisse and all his cutouts that he did late in his life, which are in the Tate Gallery. And I did this radio program, and it went out in the morning. And that evening, I went to the theatre in London, and a woman sitting in front of me recognized my voice and turned around and said, "Did you make that program about Matisse?" And the woman next to her said, "He made a program about your teeth." So it's very important you hear me, ladies and gentlemen, loud and clear. Thank you very much for inviting me to York Festival of Ideas with its theme this year of rediscover, reimagine, rebuild, because all of them, I think, apply to this afternoon's subject, because vampires have been shapeshifters, they've been remade, they've been rediscovered, they've been re-engineered in all sorts of different ways since they first emerged in fiction in the late 18th, early 19th century. It's the story that I'll be talking about. And it's a vintage year, ladies and gentlemen, to be talking about vampires, because 2021 to 2023 include a whole series of anniversaries, vampire anniversaries, which you may not have spotted. It's 200 years since the death of Dr. John William Polidori, who was Byron's physician. I'll be talking about him a little later, who died in August 1821 at his father's house in St. Pancras at the age of 25. And he's really the founding figure in this story of the vampire, particularly in prose literature. It's 100 years since the film Nosferatu opened in March 1922. It opened in Berlin at the Zoological Gardens, appropriately enough, in the Marble Hall of the Berlin Zoological Gardens. And everyone was encouraged to come to the premiere dressed in costumes that fitted the subject of the film, which had been relocated to the 1830s. So cosplay was invented by the premiere of Nosferatu. So in addition to all the other firsts we're going to be talking about, cosplay began, I think, in March 1922, and people arrived in very outlandish costumes with teeth extensions and all sorts of things. It's 125 years since Bram Stoker's novel Dracula was published, first published in May of 1897. It's 150 years since Sheridan Le Fanu's classic short story, Carmilla, a lesbian vampire story, first published in Dublin in 1872. It's 175 years since the publication of the penny dreadful, Varney the Vampire, or The Feast of Blood, published in 1847, 380 double-column pages, all about Sir Francis Varney of Ratford Hall, Yorkshire, who goes around biting people for endlessly in this penny dreadful. That was published in 1847 by a man called James Malcolm Rymer, who was an engineer. It's 30 years since Francis Ford Coppola's film Bram Stoker's Dracula, which was released in November 1992. And it's 25 years since Buffy the Vampire Slayer started on television, 1997 to 2003. So really a lot of anniversaries have been going on last year, this year, and just before. And in that 100 years, since the arrival of Nosferatu, the vampire in film and television certainly has shape-shifted from a kind of soulless predator, which is how he or she began, who comes back after death to haunt us, school of Dracula and his forebears in literature and folklore, And you can fight him with either the instruments of the church, particularly the Christian church, or with the instruments of folklore, things like garlic and so on, that go back to pre-Christian times. So he comes back to haunt us as a soulless predator. And then, in the 1970s, he became a lost soul, condemned to eternal life across the ages. School of Anne Rice's novel, Interview with the Vampire, which was published in 1976, and to some extent Stephen King's Salem's Lot, which was published the year before. The vampire has an inner life for the first time, a proper personality, is an addict with needs, and in a way being condemned to eternal life is a curse as well as a blessing. So it becomes a lost soul to, in its most recent incarnation, a soulmate. From a soulless predator to a lost soul to a soulmate who helps young mortal teenagers with their emotional ups and downs, and very occasionally, only very occasionally, indulges in sex from the neck up. The school of Twilight and Friends, and in fact it's become a whole publishing phenomenon. You know that publishers' categories are very interesting. There are now two publishers' categories. One's called paranormal romance, which actually arises out of Twilight, and one of them is called teen vampires. Extraordinary. They are actual publishers' category now. I think Twilight, film and book, were the first vampire in literature or film that could actually be recommended by parents to their children, because it's all about abstinence. But basically, from soulless predator to lost soul to soulmate, it's an extraordinary, the same set of rules really within this myth of the vampire, reconfigured in different ways, re-engineered, reimagined over the period of the history of cinema. But in all three incarnations, in his resurrection from the dead, the vampire, I think it's important to note, isn't a ghost or a spirit, but an undead physical being. And this is very, very important, the most bodily of all spiritual phenomena. As one commentator has put it, he or she represents the triumph of flesh over spirit, of the corporeal over the invisible. The vampire desires almost everything other than, the vampire only desires the gratification of the senses by physical means. It is the most materialistic of all spirits, and that's why it appeals so much to filmmakers. And so this is a corporeal being. It's not a ghost. It's not someone you can see through. It's not someone that haunts you. It's someone that comes to see you and does all sorts of sexual, physical things in the night. It's the story covered by this book, which is the Nosferatu centenary edition of Vampires. And you'll notice the cover is slightly strange, because it's a famous shot from Nosferatu of the vampire going up the stairs. It's probably the most famous shot in the whole film. And vampires aren't supposed to have shadows, ladies and gentlemen, but never mind. It made a great shot in this movie on this occasion. Nosferatu invented, you mentioned coming in from the sunlight, invented two things in vampire lore that weren't in Dracula. One of them was the idea that vampires can be destroyed by the rising sun and are creatures of the night. In Dracula, the novel, Dracula wanders around Piccadilly very happily in sunlight. No problem about that. I mean, he's not at his best. He's at his best when the sun sets, but he can cope with sunlight. But Nosferatu invented the idea of the vampire crumbling into dust when the sun rises, and so on. The second thing it invented, which is very relevant to the last few years, was the association between the vampire and the plague. That when the vampire arrives, the vampire comes accompanied by, in this case, his friends, the rats, and brings the plague to this German town. So he's a carrier of a kind of virus. One vampire bites two, bites four, bites six. Before you know you've got a pandemic. And my guess is they're probably being made as we speak, a whole spate of vampire movies that feed off anxieties about COVID, because Nosferatu set the tone for that idea of the vampire and the plague. Now, I first started working on the book in the late 1960s, way back, over half a century ago, in the old round reading room at the British Museum. It's actually the old round reading room, which Jonathan Harker mentions on the very first page of Dracula as the place where he does his research, and where Bram Stoker had a reader's ticket. And in those days, there were few, if any, scholars working on the Gothic literature. And the staff of the reading room treated me with some caution as they went to bring the books that I was ordering. Strange, obscure, Victorian, Georgian, Edwardian vampire stories and other examples of the Gothic. And they wore white gloves in those days, and they'd sort of put them down with a little bit of caution. You know, are you sure this is what you want to read? Because the great tradition of literature was the thing in those days. The great male tradition of literature, largely. Realism, Dickens, D.H. Lawrence, close reading of the text, with the occasional detour for Jane Austen, some of them, and George Eliot, one of them. And the Gothic was treated by the academic establishment as sensationalist, fantastical, full of cliches and coincidences, and not quite worthy of serious attention. Because if you go to the reading room now, there's no one who isn't studying the Gothic. Everybody is, and nobody's studying D.H. Lawrence anymore. But that's for other reasons. Horace Walpole, I remember I went to some lectures about the Walpole family in the late 60s. He was treated as too camp by half. A great disappointment to his father, the Prime Minister, Robert Walpole, who wanted his son to go into politics and marry a nice young girl, neither of which he did. And as for Anne Radcliffe, Mary Shelley and Jane Austen of Northanger Abbey fame, well, they were in the second division. They weren't treated as part of the Premier League of Literature at all. So, just as an aside, at that time, together with someone who was a very good friend of mine at that time, the novelist Angela Carter, who was working on her collection, The Bloody Chamber, which some of you may know, which revisits some of these Gothic myths from, with a feminist twist. That together with her, I wrote to Bath City Council requesting them to put up a plaque to Mary Shelley, who wrote most of Frankenstein in Bath between September and December 1816. Now, she lived in Abbey Churchyard in rented rooms, and she came back from Geneva, where she had the idea originally, and she turned the book into a triple-decker novel in Bath. And they replied, after a long delay, that they thought that Frankenstein had more to do with film than literature. It was the book of a film, really, wasn't it? So it was unworthy of a plaque. And then they added in a postscript, if the plaque were to be dedicated to Percy Shelley, then they might consider it. I mean, you know, it was like that then, in the late 60s, early 70s. By the way, Angela is featured in this book. I've included her story, The Lady of the House of Love, from The Bloody Chamber, which dates from that period. But back to the British Museum. The academic world wasn't very interested in the Gothic, but there were signs within popular culture, which, as so often, was one step ahead of academe. There were signs within popular culture, even then, that there was a kind of Gothic revival about to happen. There'd been a huge exhibition at the V&A on Aubrey Beardsley, and a recent book has actually claimed that that exhibition is the start of the goth craze in fashion, that it was a kind of spin-off from the Aubrey Beardsley cult of the mid to late 1960s. Aleister Crowley, the occultist and self-styled magus, was the subject of a cult, particularly amongst rock musicians at the time. In fact, a book's just come out called How the Occult Saved Rock Music. And so that was going on. There were Kenneth Anger, who died recently, underground filmmaker, who made various films like Scorpio Rising and the inauguration of the Pleasure Dome. And they were underground hits at the time. Sgt. Pepper's album sleeve, there's Edgar Allan Poe, featured very prominently, and John Lennon kept going on about Edgar Allan Poe and his short stories. And the old Hollywood monsters, you know, Bela Lugosi as Dracula and Karloff as Frankenstein, had become sort of camp. You know, we had the Munsters on television and the Addams Family. And the old actors who used to play those parts were taking guest appearances in all sorts of weekly television programs. And it had become the stuff of parody. And Hammer Films were still in business, but they were slugging it out with The Night of the Living Dead and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. New things were happening in the horror movie, and Hammer was losing. By the time The Exorcist came along in the early 1970s, Hammer had almost completely lost. So back in the British Museum, because no one was reading these books, it was great because they were always in stock. You never had anybody else reading them, so whenever I asked for anything, they'd arrive. And I remember an extraordinary moment I had when I was originally researching this book. I noticed that in Das Kapital, bear with me this, in Das Kapital, Karl Marx writes a chapter on the working day in 1867. And in that chapter, there's a whole series of vampire references. He refers to capital as dead labor and the relationship between the capitalist and the worker as a vampiric relationship. One feeds off the other, and they're into a sort of mutually destructive master-servant relationship. And I was fascinated by Karl Marx liked Gothic stories. He read the stories of E.T.A. Hoffmann. In fact, the opening line of the Communist Manifesto is, a spectre is haunting Europe, etc. So he was into all this, but where did he get his vampires from? And there's a footnote in Das Kapital to a book about the history of Eastern Europe, and it's called, in French actually, but it's called The History of the Danubian Principalities, the Principalities of the Danube, 1855. And I thought, well, he didn't have a page reference, but Karl Marx had a reference to this book in that chapter in Capital. So I thought, well, I'll get it out. Now, Karl Marx wrote Capital in the British Museum reading room. And the most extraordinary thing happened. This book arrived, it was huge, it was about 600 pages. The History of the Danubian Principalities, 1855, by Elias Regnault. And I thought, how am I going to find this reference to vampires? And I opened it, and it fell open at that page. And I think that what had happened was, first of all, that nobody had read it since Karl Marx had it out. But secondly, that he's the sort of chap who used to lean on books like this, when you're reading them, and with the awful, really, with the page open. And it fell open at the point. It was quite extraordinary. It was uncanny, actually. So I didn't have to do any research in this book. There it was. It had a whole thing about Vlad the Impaler, about how the feudal system was just as cruel in Christian Europe as in other cultures, and all the references that Karl Marx did. So it was extraordinary, actually, researching all this. And in the book, I've got a vampire mosaic, which is basically the fruits of that period, where I think I've managed to list every single vampire of 19th century literature. It's a bit rash to say that, because someone always comes up with something. From Polidori's first thing right through to Dracula in 1897, and there are hundreds of them. I ran down every rabbit hole that was available. But the book then grew and grew. The first reason it grew was the discovery of Bram Stoker's working papers for Dracula. He took lots of notes on what he was reading and when he was drafting the novel, and they turned up in a library in Philadelphia. And they'd been sold by his widow, Florence, shortly after he died in April 1912. For example, there's about 10 pages on his visit to Whitby in the summer of 1891, almost day by day, about what he did and the Coast Guard that he spoke to, and wandering around the churchyard. So real detailed stuff about the writing of Dracula. So that was another reason why the book got bigger. Secondly, a book came out in the 1970s about Vlad the Impaler, who was the voivode of Wallachia at about the same time as Richard III in this country, and who it was claimed by this book was the original of Bram Stoker's Dracula. I don't think he was. In fact, I can prove it. Read the book. But it did wonders for the Romanian tourist industry. Everybody had to go over and see Vlad's castle, and actually it isn't Vlad's castle what they're shown, but never mind. So that was another sort of thing that he had the name Dracula of the line of the Draculas, but that's about it. Usually book dealers kept coming up with little bits of information, unknown books that went through their hands, and bits of research came out of this that were very interesting. For example, there's a short story called Wake Not the Dead, and it was attributed to a German romantic writer, poet and writer called Johann Ludwig Tieck, T-I-E-C-K, quite a well-known figure. And in the first edition of that, that's what I wrote. But it turns out it was actually written by someone completely different. But it took a second-hand book dealer finding the original of this story to establish that. So that was another aspect of this in terms of the expansion of the research. And then much later, in 2006, I co-curated, and we'll see some pictures in a minute, an exhibition at Tate Britain called Gothic Nightmares, Blake, Fuseli, and the Romantic Imagination. And the idea for this, I've always wondered why everyone writes, by then everyone was writing about Gothic literature, but nobody was writing about what the visual artists were up to at the time, between the 1780s and the 1820s. And it turns out an awful lot of them were very interested in Gothic themes. So you get ghosts, spirits, vampires, the nightmare, famous painting by Fuseli, and so on. So we were trying to explore that. And the exhibition was centered on this painting, The Nightmare, which I'm sure you'll recognize in a minute, first exhibited in 1782. And some of the fruits of that exhibition are in the pictures in this book. And finally, there was Dr. Polidori himself, that when he died, Lord Byron, who had fallen out with him, and in fact he sacked him as his physician, Lord Byron wrote that poor old Polidori, he killed himself at such a young age, and made a bit of a joke about it, really, that this guy couldn't get anything together in his life, and now he can't get anything together in his death. Then somebody started looking at the inquest report on Polidori's death, and it turns out he probably didn't commit suicide at all. He had a riding accident in Norwich shortly before he died, and he fell on his head, after which he had very serious migraines, and then he died. So even in his death, poor old Polidori wasn't allowed much dignity. When I originally wrote this book, I read Polidori's thesis, which he submitted to the University of Edinburgh in summer 1815, in partial fulfillment of his degree as a doctor, medical doctor, MD. And he submitted a thesis on sleepwalking and other trance-like states. And in fact, he had two case studies of how the mind works during the hours of sleep, according to knowledge in 1815. He had to submit it in Latin. I had to read it in Latin, would you believe? But in 2010, it's been translated now, and it's quite well known in the medical literature. So it's a very fluid subject. So, and it's all changed, you know, the study of the Gothic for lots of reasons, partly the rise of women's studies, I think, we were talking about this earlier, Mary Shelley, Jane Austen, Anne Radcliffe, partly with the rise of women's studies, partly with a reaction against the realism of Dickens and D.H. Lawrence towards the fantastical, the fairy tale, the Gothic, metaphors, stepping into other worlds. For all those reasons, and many others besides, the Gothic is very, very fashionable. And I'm always very, very thrilled when I go to conferences and people talk about the early version of this book as, in a way, the book that made vampires respectable, that actually kick-started the vampire studies in the academic world. And I'm very, very proud of that, because it's become, as I say, a huge area of study. So let's go, before we get to the pictures, let's go back to Nosferatu for a second. The film opened 100 years ago, March 1922. And what on earth are we doing celebrating it when there's so much else to celebrate in the centenary of 1922? After all, 1922 was called by the American poet Ezra Pound as year one of the new era. The previous era, he said, ended in October 1921, the day that James Joyce wrote the final words of his novel Ulysses. 1922 was the year when literary modernism was born. It began with the publication of Ulysses in February, and ended with the publication of T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland in October 1922. So the most influential English language novel of the century and the most influential English language poem of the century bookended 1922. So how on earth does Nosferatu fit into that? Well, as I say, it opened in March 1922. It was directed by Friedrich Wilhelm Murnau. It was a bootleg production. They hadn't cleared the rights, and it's for complicated reasons. And Mrs. Stoker, Stoker's widow, who made no money at all out of any of other Bram Stoker's writings, made a little bit out of Dracula, and so she chased the production and tried to get some money, and eventually the court ruled that all copies of Nosferatu had to be destroyed, which of course they weren't, which is why we can see it today. Like the vampire, the film kept resurrecting all over the place, and there's now some very good prints available with very nice musical scores. The title, Nosferatu, was taken from Bram Stoker's novel Dracula, in which Dr. Van Helsing, the intrepid vampire hunter, asserts on several occasions that the word Nosferatu means vampire or undead in the Romanian language. The word certainly sounded creepy, but in fact, I'm sorry to tell you, there is no such word in the modern Romanian language. Stoker found it in an article he read on Transylvanian folklore, and in that article it appears that there's a mishearing of the Romanian word, I'm sorry about the pronunciation, any Romanians in the audience, Nesuferitu, meaning the insufferable one, or Necuratu, meaning the unclean one, which doesn't sound nearly as good as Nosferatu. So Van Helsing's definition, and the film which was based on it, was based on mishearing something. I love the idea that the whole of vampire cinema is based on mishearing something. You didn't quite get it right, but it's a great, great title. Never mind. Nosferatu is a terrific word, and it was that title under which the film opened in March 1922. Like the word Dracula. You know, originally Bram Stoker was going to call his novel The Dead Undead, and he only corrected the title on the proofs at the very last stage, so Dracula. I wonder if we'd still be talking about it if it was called The Dead Undead. I got the feeling it would have ended up in those dusty shelves in the British Library, and none of us would really be following it. But Dracula, Nosferatu, great titles. The premiere, as I say, was in the Marble Hall of Berlin Zoological Society. At the time, it was seen by critics as fitting well into year one of modernism, which seems odd in some ways because the film was set in 1838, and was centrally concerned with an ancient superstition. So the question is, how did Murnau's film Nosferatu, the foundation of all subsequent vampire cinema, how did it fit in with the birth of modernism in the other arts in 1922, when it opened shortly after Ulysses was published? Now I want to, at this point, just two quotations if I might, before we move on to the pictures. This is from Ulysses by James Joyce, published in February 1922. He comes, pale vampire, through storm his eyes, his bat sails bloodying the sea, mouth to her mouth's kiss. Here, my tablets, mouth to her kiss. Must be two of them, glue 'em well together, mouth to her mouth's kiss. Right? That's an explicit reference to two moments in Dracula. One of them, when Jonathan Harker is trapped in Castle Dracula, and he writes his diary, you know, about what's going on. He says, my tablets, 'tis meet I write it down, which is actually a misquotation from Hamlet. So tablets in James Joyce is a direct reference to Jonathan Harker. But more to the point, there's that great scene where the ship sails into Whitby Harbour, and Dracula has massacred the entire crew, and a dog leaps off the boat and all the rest of it. So, you know, her bat sails bloodying the sea is clearly a reference to that reference to Dracula. So James Joyce is referring to Dracula, and here's a quote from The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot, 1922, October. A woman drew her long black hair out tight and fiddled whisper music on those strings, and bats with baby faces in the violet light whistled and beat their wings and crawled head downwards down a blackened wall. And upside down in air were towers, tolling reminiscent bells that kept the hours and voices singing out of empty cisterns and exhausted wells. And bats crawled head downward down a blackened wall, which is, of course, a reference to Dracula, the famous scene where Jonathan Harker looks out of the window of the castle and sees the Count crawling down the wall with his cloak billowing, resembling a bat. So it's a two-way street, ladies and gentlemen. You know, we tend to think that the sort of literature I'm talking about is ghettoized into low culture, as it were, popular culture, and that there's this other thing going on, which is the James Joyces and T.S. Eliots of this world. It is a two-way street and has been ever since the late 19th century. Great. Dr. John William Polidori, as I say, he was Byron's physician. He accompanied Byron and Shelley and Mary Godwin to Geneva in 1816. And this is a fanciful portrait of Lord Byron. by a Scots painter called George Sanders. He never looked remotely like that. In fact, he was very overweight. He was constantly on a diet, Lord Byron, which did himself quite serious damage at times. But here's the public image of Lord Byron, mean, moody and magnificent and very, very romantic, with his servant, with whom he was said to have had a particularly close relationship. This is interesting. It's taken from a little miniature done in Geneva in 1816 of the 18-year-old Mary Godwin. Now, there's a portrait of her sitting at a desk with a quill pen, which appears in most books about Mary Shelley. It is not Mary Shelley. It is now proven that that is not a portrait of Mary Shelley. This is what she looked like when she wrote Frankenstein. It's coloured. We've coloured it, which is slightly naughty, but it was a miniature actually from the right period. That is what Mary Shelley looks like. This is a painting by W.P. Frith, late Victorian, Derby Day, etc., of Mary and Percy Shelley courting in St Pancras graveyard, sitting on the tomb of Mary Wollstonecraft, who was buried in St Pancras graveyard. So it's all very, very symbolic. And Mary would go home to her father, William Godwin, and say, it's all very innocent and so on, but since she gave birth to her first child 7 months later, I get the feeling that there was more than just kissing going on in St Pancras churchyard. This is the arrival in Geneva. This is from the Geneva archives. It's quite funny because, there's all this stuff in the news about how the passports of and people arriving and leaving from the UK, it's chaos at the moment at Heathrow because the digital thing, well, it was always chaos, ladies and gentlemen. They've got all the dates wrong and most of the names of the people who arrived in Geneva. So Polidori becomes Polydor, and they actually arrived at the beginning of June, and it's registered as the 11th and 13th of July. So they didn't need a computer to mess up the passports in those days. Already it was pretty chaotic. But they arrived in Geneva for a summer holiday at the Villa Diodati, which overlooks Lake Geneva. It's still there. Beautiful house. Byron was convinced that Milton had stayed there. Since it was actually built in the late 17th century, that's unlikely because it didn't actually exist when Milton was around. But nevertheless, it was a romantic idea that Milton had stayed there. There it is, overlooking the lake. Top right. Well, this is me pretending to be Lord Byron, going to see it. Wearing a Rupert scarf. It's a bit unfortunate. Anyway, it's a fantastic house, and what's amazing about it is it's so uncreepy. You think that the house where, all these great stories emerged is going to be really spooky. It's incredibly sort of affluent and over the top and high bourgeois as a villa. I was hoping, I've actually stayed the night in it, hoping something might happen, get an idea, but not at all. Here we are filming in the living room. This is the room in which Frankenstein and the vampire were first concocted. And just look at it, it's not spooky. I mean, it's sort of Laura Ashley. It's kind of, very comfortable and domestic as a house. Lord Byron would sit on the balcony looking at the Jura Mountains beyond and looking at the thunderstorms over the mountains, so I thought I'd do the same, and without the same effect, I'm afraid. They all sat down on the night of the 16th of June, 1816, and read this book. It's a collection of ghost stories called the Phantasmagoriana. It was in French, translated from the German, and it begins with a family bet of a group of people saying, who can tell the nastiest story? And whoever tells the nastiest story wins the prize. And it gave them an idea. Shelley, in fact, had the idea. Why don't we do that? It's raining. We're trapped indoors. They were all very highly strung. Quite a lot of dope was taken, supplied by Polidori from the local pharmacy. And so why don't we tell nasty stories to each other? Right. And so this is Gilray's wonderful print, Tales of Wonder, which is about a similar idea. His three ladies reading M.G. Lewis's book, Tales of Wonder. And if you look at the watch, you can't quite see it, but it's well past their bedtime. It's 1:45. And there's a rather stern-looking governess who doesn't approve of this kind of literature at all, but they're loving it. You imagine they're like the characters in Northanger Abbey, reading the latest Gothic novels. And they started thinking dark thoughts. This is Goya's famous etching, "The sleep of reason produces monsters." In his case, owls and bats and a cat. And what happened next has been mythologized so much that it's actually quite difficult to get back to what actually happened that night. But this is the prologue of The Bride of Frankenstein, 1936, by James Whale, which actually has the nerve to begin with. In the middle is Byron, on the left is Mary Shelley, the middle distance is Shelley, a chambermaid with 3 extremely improbable dogs, and a very, very high ceiling. Hollywood loved these vast sets, in those days. And so Byron says, it's such a pity that Frankenstein finished with the creature being destroyed and all the rest of it. He said, oh, it didn't finish there. There's a sequel, The Bride of Frankenstein. It's absolutely craven to do this, but they did. They revisited that evening. There they are chatting. And this in fact is a fusion of Fuseli's painting The Nightmare with Mary Shelley. It's Mary Shelley lying there being visited by the imp in the night before she comes up with Frankenstein, publicising Ken Russell's film Gothic. They talked about something that had happened in the 18th century, which was that a soldier, a Hajduk, in Serbia, on the far reaches of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a man called Arnold Paul, had fallen off a hay wagon and died in 1732. And 3 days later, he came back and he started biting the local inhabitants. And it was in a rural community in the far reaches of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Now, no one would have noticed, but the Emperor of Austria decided to launch a public inquiry into what really happened, because it almost turned into a civil disturbance, as he seemed to be coming back and biting people and smothering them, also biting cows. He certainly wasn't a vegetarian. I mean, animals and humans. And a large report was written by a regimental surgeon, which was published all over Europe and caused an enormous discussion about what was really going on. A discussion in which Voltaire and Rousseau and Diderot and all the great philosophers of 18th century France had a go. And some people thought it was premature burial, that he wasn't dead at all, that he came back 3 days later. Some people thought it was a form of plague in the village, rabies maybe, connected with biting. Some people thought it was a chemical reaction between the decomposing corpse and the earth around it, which had done strange things. Because the other thing about Arnold Paul was that his hair and his nails had grown after death, which actually happens. But they didn't know that in the 18th century. Or was it just funerary customs of pre-literate societies, trying to displace their grief onto... So whatever it was, it can't be vampires, can it? Rousseau, on his own, said, this is really interesting because if you read in the Bible about miracles, there's much less evidence for miracles than there is for what happened in 1732, because here's an official report signed by this regimental surgeon and by the Empress. So if there's as much evidence for vampires as miracles, do we believe both of them or do we believe neither of them? And he also said the vampire is a very useful metaphor for the relationship between the establishment and the rest of us, and particularly the tax office and the rest of us, that sort of dominance-dependence, the thing that was picked up by Karl Marx. So, big debate, and the introduction to the Phantasmagoria summarizes that debate. So that's what they were thinking about, vampires, on the night they started talking. This is the Lamia, another version of the vampire. In the French Revolution, vampires appeared in popular imagery quite a lot, had appeared. This is a monster that was said to be found in Chile, which appeared in a very popular magazine, with the face of a man, a lion's horns, and a sort of harpy's tail. And I found this image in this magazine from the 1780s. And then I found all these where Marie Antoinette is presented as a vampire. They take, the image from the Chilean vampire and turn it into Marie Antoinette. So the image of the Ancien Regime, the Versailles, the royal family, they're vampires sucking our blood. So vampirism became quite a popular image in the French Revolution. So that's what they were talking about in the Villa Diodati on that night in June 1816. Of course, the plaque, which has only recently been changed, says Lord Byron, English poet, author of The Prisoner of Chillon, lived in the Villa Diodati in 1816 and composed the third chant of Childe Harold. No reference to Mary Shelley, no reference to Polidori, just to Byron. And in fact, as I say, in Bath we had difficulty getting a plaque put up, and where the Shelleys moved to, in Marlow, there is a plaque on the house, Percy Shelley lived here. Until recently, Mary was written out of the story almost completely. And, I've been trying to fly the flag, as have many, for putting her back into history. So that night, Mary Godwin, aged 18, came up with Frankenstein, the creation scene. And everyone was shattered, this 18-year-old girl coming up with this extraordinary story about the creation of a human with a quote from Paradise Lost. Did I request thee, maker, from my clay to mould me man? Did I solicit thee from darkness to promote me? That's Adam talking to God. Did I ask to be created? Look what you've done, right? And that's really the starting point for Frankenstein. But that same night, Lord Byron told a story about an aristocrat called Darvel, who goes on a grand tour and ends up in a cemetery with a friend, and he dies, and he's resurrected by the light of the moon. And he's clearly a vampire. But the story runs to about 2 or 3 pages, and then he stopped. He lost interest. Polidori was taking notes. So later that summer, after he was sacked, Polidori in Geneva, over 2 or 3 days, expanded Byron's short story into The Vampire, a tale. Instead of Darvel, Lord Ruven, the evil aristocratic vampire. So already the vampire, who starts out in rural communities amongst peasants in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, becomes an aristocrat, Lord Ruven. So the metaphor of the aristocrat and the rest of us. But also he comes back from the graveyard and gets involved in the season in London and bites his way through the season, debutantes and all this. And anyway, it was a huge success. Whereas Frankenstein, when it came out in 1818, went through 1 edition and was very expensive, and they didn't sell out in that edition. The Vampire went through 3 editions in 1 year. So this was the great hit at the time. And immediately, theatrical versions started appearing. No such thing as intellectual property in those days. It was fair game. They all did it. So you get The Vampire, and at the bottom, Presumption or The Fate of Frankenstein. We're talking about 1826, the first horror double bill in a theatre in London. Extraordinary. And many, many different versions. And in fact, no one's quite sure how this started, but this started appearing when Frankenstein was shown with The Vampire in Birmingham. And this is handed round to the audience about how moral and religious conduct of the population of Birmingham. This is non-moral, non-religious. You shouldn't watch it. It'll corrupt you. It'll corrupt your servants. It'll corrupt your wife, which of course made it a huge hit. And some people think that actually the manager of the Playhouse printed these, knowing that it would be a great commercial. I don't know, but this was circulated in the audience. And Penny Plain, so a version of Lord Ruven was reset in Scotland called The Vampire or The Bride of the Isles, and he appeared in the Ruven tartan with a piper on the stage, and this was a huge hit, The Vampire or The Bride of the Isles, which was shown at Covent Garden before it became an opera house. I love this. On the right is Lord Gowrie, Mrs. Thatcher's Minister of the Arts. Now, Mrs. Thatcher's Minister of the Arts, I noticed from Who's Who, was of the Ruven family, R-U-T-H-V-E-N. And I thought, my God, he's related to the first vampire in English literature. So I persuaded him to appear as Lord Ruven. There's the Ruven tartan. And we did an extract from The Vampire of the Bride of the Isles for television with Lord Gowrie playing his forebear. It was absolutely marvellous. And he was very disappointed in the tartan. He looked at it. He said, I thought it was going to be very traditional. It looks like Bob Hope's golfing trousers. Anyway, extraordinary line. There we are. Here he is. Mrs. Thatcher's Minister of the Arts as Lord Ruven. So, I don't know if you've read the interview with the vampire, but there's the Théâtre des Vampires in Paris in the 1820s. It's featured. It was like that, you know, sort of England, in London and Paris, and all over England, and in fact all over France, all sorts of versions of the vampire. There's Frankenstein. Then in 1831, a popular edition of Frankenstein comes out, which does better, a cut-down version, rewritten by Mary Shelley, softened, which is the only known illustration of the creature that we know that Mary Shelley approved. And of course, it looks nothing like what we expect. It doesn't look like Boris Karloff, doesn't have a bolt in his neck, doesn't have a big cranium. It's Vitruvian Man, it's perfect. I mean, his features have been chosen as perfect. This is perfection. They've been sewn together, and there's something that doesn't quite add up about him. He's dead behind the eyes. When you look at him, it doesn't quite work, but he looks amazing. And for some reason, he's 8 foot, which Mel Brooks made much of in Young Frankenstein. But that we won't go into that. But so there's the young Frankenstein, who in the novel is a young research student. So he's not, you know, Peter Cushing. He's not a mature man. He's a young research student. In that postpartum moment where he sees what he's done, dashes out of the laboratory and leaves the creature, and thereby hangs his tail. That rejection, in a way, is the moment, the pivotal moment where you know, the creature has been rejected by his father, and he doesn't have a mother, and all sorts of things happen as a result of that. So this illustration is really quite interesting, and it's by Theodor von Holst, who'd recently illustrated Goethe's Faust, and if you look at it, it's very similar. Same window, and sort of skulls on the floor and that sort of thing. Anyway. But at the same time, popular editions of the vampire start appearing. But they don't appear under Polidori's name, they appear under Lord Byron's name. So the full version, as it were, which was written by Polidori, is presented as if by Lord Byron, and that's what helped it to become a bestseller. Goethe, in Germany, called it the English poet's greatest work. And he hadn't even written it. But there we go. Then in 1847, I mentioned Varney the Vampire, or The Feast of Blood, this huge penny dreadful with wonderful, crude woodcut illustrations by James Malcolm Rymer, set initially in Yorkshire, and it basically tells the story of the vampire over and over and over again. He got paid a penny a line for writing, so he made it last, you know. And 3 volumes. There's only 1 copy in existence. It's in the British Library because this is a very cheap paper with big sort of chunks of woodblock in it. And but it's there it is, a bound copy, which is where we got these illustrations. But it's wonderful, and he keeps appearing in different periods. You know, so that it starts off as contemporary, and then he's Charles II. You know, well, what the hell? Let's tell the story again. And then he's in the Middle Ages, and then he's all over, and he ends up by falling into Mount Vesuvius, which finishes him off. There's a rather out-of-scale stake. Now, Rymer introduced lots of elements in the process of rewriting the story. Introduced the ghost ship arriving at a harbour, introduced fangs for the vampire for the first time, introduced puncture marks in the neck, introduced the staking, the vigil by the tomb, all these things. In trying to bring the changes and make this story go on for 878 double-column pages, which he did, all sorts of new ideas came out, as often do with sequels. And so a lot of the things that were picked up by Dracula, and indeed by Nosferatu, came through Varney. Now, just finally, how do you visualize the vampire? And I want to go through this quite quickly, but okay, on the page, there's Lord Ruthven, there's Varney, there's all sorts of female vampires in France, and finally in 1897 we've got Dracula, which combines several vampire traditions, the aristocratic vampire, the vampire countess, the brides of Dracula, and the folkloric vampire, the peasant vampire. All 3 are sort of combined by Bram Stoker. But how do we visualize it, and how did they in the 19th century? And I mentioned the exhibition at the Tate that I was involved in. 1782, The Nightmare by Fuseli. The nightmare is not the horse, the blind horse. The nightmare is the creature sitting on the woman's chest. It's a Mara, a nightmare of folklore. And included in the painting are all the contemporary explanations of nightmares. Nightmares are when you've got a weight on your chest. Nightmare is when you're lying on your left. Nightmare is when, look at the bedside table, when you've been taking some opioid to make you go to sleep. These are all these are the rational explanations of nightmares in 1782. But the folkloric explanation is it's a blind horse, it's a mare, it's a sort of joke. But he says that, the imp has been riding the horse into the lady's bedroom and sits on her chest. This painting caused a sensation. It was exhibited at the Royal Academy show in 1982, and I've worked out exactly where it was hanging. On one side were a painting of Mr. Pitt's horses, the Prime Minister's horses, and on the left was a rural cottage scene. And you can imagine, they went, what the hell is this? There've been lots of paintings of individual nightmares. Richard III's nightmare, the night before Bosworth, Julius Caesar's nightmare, Conscience nightmare, but there'd never been the nightmare, a generic nightmare, and what might cause them. Horace Walpole hated it. He said it was vulgar, which is, talk about the pot calling the kettle black, but anyway. And so the history of this image starts. This is the imp. I do believe that the makeup of Nosferatu, by the way, owes a lot to this. This was Fuseli's print version, which became a huge bestseller. And another. This is William Blake, 1820, a painting that was known as The Vampire and became known in the 20th century as The Ghost of a Flea. It's a flea with a dagger in its hand and this strange sort of muscular body and its little bowl where the blood is and so on. This toured the country as The Vampire by William Blake on board. It's in the Tate, tiny. And then the satirists began to take over. This is the politician Charles James Fox having a nightmare the night before the general election. Here's Charles James Fox and William Pitt slugging it out, both of them scared by the French Revolution, looking in through the window. See, the sans-culotte with beady eyes. This is, I'm sorry about this one, Nightmare looking for the source of the Nile. Lord Nelson looking for the source of the Nile. It's a rude version. This is Blake, Jerusalem, in the original version, one of his the winged creature in Book 3 of Jerusalem. This is a Lord Mayor's day. He was a banker, actually, and he's obviously been eating much too much, and he's been indulging, and so he has... another explanation of the nightmare is eating very rich food just before you go to sleep. Here it is. And then the book illustrators. This is a man called Tony Johanneau, French, a book called Smara or the Demons of the Night, a vampire story. This is a collection of prints called Les Diableries Érotiques, erotic Satanism. And what's interesting about this print is it belonged to Sigmund Freud. And it's a strange sort of sexual version of the nightmare in different ways. And Freud obviously, I don't know what he made of it, but it was in his collection. This is a waxworks in Munich, which Bram Stoker visited in the late 1880s, a version of the nightmare. I don't even want to go into the gender or race elements of all this, but it's getting pretty heavy. This is Munch, the Harpy, 1880s. Wonderful painting, Munch the Vampire, red-headed, cat-like creature smothering this victim. This is Felicien Rops, the biggest love of Don Juan. Terrifying picture of the sort of Byron figure and this emaciated victim. This is based on it. It's a painting of, a print of the late 19th century called Dead Mother. And it's a woman lying on a funeral bier and the baby looking utterly confused, based on Fuseli's nightmare. And behind it, a sapling is growing in this big forest. So the sapling has got to grow and somehow grow through this growth that's in its way. It's a terrifying image. It's a kind of Freudian version of Fuseli's nightmare. And then the illustrations to Dracula. There he is shinning down the wall of his castle from the first paperback edition of 1901, which we know that Bram Stoker approved. That's the reference in The Wasteland. Do you remember I read the quote? Which became the great image for Dracula. This is the first American paperback edition. This is the English paper edition. This was taken off the first American paperback edition. And then we get to the cinema, where the nightmare keeps recurring as an image. This is the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, production drawings, 1919. Nosferatu production drawing. The figure at the window with the eyes, and the victim. It's a lot of northern, I mean, where Hollywood was concerned, a lot of the production designers and art directors came from Northern Europe. And when they got out of Europe with the rise of Hitler, they took with them a Northern European aesthetic. So Munch and Fuseli are very, very strong as images in horror movies. They weren't very well known in America, but they were extremely well known amongst the culture of these people. This is Nosferatu. Now, of course, subsequently, vampires have become a little bit more attractive, a sort of lounge lizard as well as a lizard, whereas he is far from that. He's got rodent teeth and ears like a bat, and one production feature is extraordinary. His talons grow as the film progresses. They get longer, very creepy. Here he is. She's keeping him busy until the rising sun, with this new invention of the idea that the rising sun will kill him. There he is with the rats, which he brings with the plague. Nosferatu, March 1922, production drawing. Arriving at Whitby, or in the case of the film, a German port. And that's the cover of the book. And he shouldn't have a shadow, as I say, but doesn't it look great? Look at his talons, you know, they're getting, yeah. The nightmare. And then we're off. Hollywood, Bela Lugosi, 1931, Hungarian actor, couldn't speak English. His line readings take half the running time. You know, he speaks very, very slowly. I am Dracula. You think, get on with it, you know, but it doesn't matter. Children of the Night, what music they make and all this. Bela Lugosi, and the film isn't actually very good, but his performance became iconic. And evening dress, cloak and swagger, you know, all of that, which becomes indelibly part of the vampire, which isn't in the novel or in Nosferatu, is invented by Hollywood. You have to wear evening dress if you're a vampire. There he is on the steps of his castle, and for some reason, just after he's standing there, you get an armadillo who walks across. You think, it's in Texas? I mean, what's going on? Why have you got armadillos in Transylvania? Anyway, they must have had a spare armadillo in the studio, and, you know. Oh, yes. And you even get explicit references to Fuseli's nightmare in the way that these stories are visualized. All right? Think of that image. This is a still from Frankenstein, 1931. And instead of the horse at the window, it's the creature. Even on the poster, at the bottom. And very often, in visualizing horror, you turn to fine art images and adapt them. This is Francis Bacon, Figures at the Base of the Crucifixion, 1944, Alien. And Geiger, the designer of Alien, admitted that there's a kind of connection of inspiration between the central figure and Alien. So very often these images come from fine art. Then Hammer, 1957, Technicolor, Victorian, all about repression, how repressed Victorian people are, and that the victims become whole people for the first time once they've been bitten. So instead of becoming sort of simpering victims, they become full-blooded women once they've been bitten. So suddenly it's turning. The vampires aren't so bad after all. They're kind of liberators in a funny way. Christopher Lee. And finally, Sigmund Freud, right? I mentioned him with reference to that print. Here's the exterior of his Freud's consulting rooms in Vienna, Bergstrasse. So imagine yourself going to Freud for a little bit of analysis, right? Knock on the door, Professor Freud, go up the stairs. And what do you find on the wall? This was on the wall of Freud's consulting room in Vienna. I'm afraid I had to take it as a still from there's a film made of the consulting rooms shortly before Freud fled from Germany and came to Hampstead, and it's fuzzy, but you can see it. So if you didn't feel poorly before you went in, you sure as hell felt pretty bad by the time your turn came. Oh, this was, yes, I rather fell out with a critic called Brian Sewell, and anyway, another kind of nightmare. So the vampire is a shapeshifter, all sorts of different versions, from literature, from film, and as I say, this is the year to celebrate them because of all the anniversaries. Thank you very much for coming this afternoon.
for such a rich and entertaining talk. I think we have some time for questions now, if anyone would like to kick off. It's hard to see.
I've battered everyone into submission.
Yeah, question over here. Yeah, great.
The view with them in Geneva was famously clear with those summons. Do you think that really did make a difference, or would the story have been written anyway?
No, I think it was. They now think it was a tsunami, in what's now Indonesia, and a volcanic eruption, which caused all this dust to come into Western Europe. Rather like a few years ago, it happened with an eruption in Iceland. And it was a particularly bad summer, and the harvest was ruined, and there was a lot of poverty in Switzerland as a result, because the farmers couldn't bring in their harvest. But it meant these very sensitive people, and they were very young. I mean, Polidori was 19, Byron was 28, but Mary Shelley was 18. They were kids, basically, locked together in this villa with it pouring with rain all the time. And they all hoped to go out on the lake in a boat, go fishing, go and visit the castle of Chillon, but they were trapped. And since there wasn't a Scrabble kit available, they had to work out how to. So I think it was I think the chemistry was there, but I think the form that it took of that ghost story session was as a result of them being cooped up for so long. They'd been cooped up for about a fortnight when it happened. And I discovered in the Geneva archives, there was a breaking and entering 2 nights before. The villa was actually robbed, and various things were stolen. So there was a tension in the air. The police had been to see them, the Geneva police, the day before the ghost story session. So not only are they all cooped up, there's a kind of tension in the air, I think. They're all dropping a thing called black drop, which is a tincture of opium dissolved in alcohol. They're all doing that a bit too much. And they're scaring the pants off each other, So I think there are definite connections. It's a rare example of a direct connection between the weather and an historical event. Had they been boating on the lake, I suspect that they'd have all been thinking about Rousseau and the joys of spring and sunshine and so on. And I doubt we'd have got Frankenstein or the vampire. So I was once asked when I was chairing the Arts Council, if there was any night in history where I'd like to have been present, and they all expected me to say, the night that Van Gogh cut his ear off, or the night that Michelangelo finished the Sistine Chapel. I said, the night of, June 1816, I just really would have liked to have been there to see Mary Godwin coming down the stairs and starting the creation sequence from Frank. It must have been an extraordinary moment, and the others were shocked. Where did that come from? I mean, here's this girl, she's been brought up by her dad, William Godwin, because her mum died in childbirth, Mary Wollstonecraft. William Godwin had a fabulous library, the best private library in London, so she read a lot, but she wasn't that well educated. She didn't have much formal education. Where did it come from? I'd have loved to have been there, I must say. Probably been really boring, but who knows? I mean, so yes, it was the weather. I do think it actually affected that cooped upness that they had that encouraged this family bet. Byron was furious about what Polidori had done. He was furious for 2 reasons. 1, because he didn't give Polidori permission to rewrite the story, and 2, because everyone thought it was by him, and he thought it was substandard. Damn the vampire, he said, what have I got to do with vampires? And then he started taking the mickey out of Polidori in his correspondence, which is why when Polidori dies, a couple of years later, Polly's killed himself, you expect that from that idiot, but it does appear that he didn't actually. There were other causes, but so all of that starts that night. Yeah.
The question at the back there. Yeah.
Fantastic talk. Can you say a little bit more about the late Victorian literary imagination, where it links vampirism with syphilis and eugenics and those sorts of concerns about declining race at the time?
Yes. Well, there's been a lot written about. There's a book by Max Nordau called Degeneration, which came out shortly before Dracula, which is all about how a good old Anglo-Saxon stock is being polluted by other races, right? And it was very much to do with racial theory of the late 19th century, eugenics basically, where the races were categorized in white Anglo-Saxon Protestant at the top of the tree, and slowly you go down. and degeneration, and there's a sense in Dracula of, these young men in England are about to be degenerated by a force outside England. You know, an immigrant is coming. He's arriving by boat at Whitby. Actually, I hadn't thought of that. Stop the boats and all that. But anyway, he arrives by boat at Whitby and begins to pollute good old Anglo-Saxon London. And some people have argued that there's a theme of degeneration in that. You know, instead of the British Empire colonising everybody else, we're being colonised by the other as the vampire comes to England, and this will cause degenerate stock. And I think that's in there. I do think, actually, that Bram Stoker was aware of that. The syphilis thing, when Bram Stoker died, the death certificate, I'm afraid I don't know the medical phrase, it's in Latin, but it said exhaustion, and then this phrase in Latin, which can mean syphilis. And some people have argued that he died of syphilis, in which case he might well have had it when he wrote Dracula, so he had plague on his mind. And also, it tainted his attitude towards relationships between men and women. It's been argued, I'm not sure about that. I mean, I personally think that Bram Stoker hadn't got a clue about what he was doing when he wrote Dracula. That it's one of those books where there's a kind of, it's a strange word, but there's a kind of innocence about it. I think he thought it was a form of techno-fiction, where you get typewriters and Winchester rifles and blood transfusions and all the latest things, you know, like a Michael Crichton novel today, Jurassic Park or something. And that it's the public schools 11, Lord Godalming and Jonathan Harker, the solicitor, versus Satan. You know, it's goodies and baddies and so on. But in the process of writing it, he wrote, rather like a fable or a fairy tale, this kind of receptacle which can receive endless interpretations. In the way that, Snow White can, or Sleeping Beauty can, or, that's one of the roles of fairy tales. We can project onto it the concerns of each generation and remake it. And it's one of those books which lives as a myth. But I personally don't think there's nothing in his biography. You know, he married this very beautiful girl, Florence, who was, by the way, Oscar Wilde's ex-girlfriend in Dublin. And they had a son, Noel. And it was a famous marriage. They held court in Cheyne Walk, Chelsea, living beyond their means, which is why he wrote novels in the evening. He worked at Lyceum Theatre as Henry Irving's manager in the daytime, and then in the evening he'd go home and write these novels. He needed the extra income. And there's nothing in his biography that suggests that he was aware of the kind of things that people are now projecting onto it, which doesn't mean it's not viable, because those things were in the ether, there's no question. You know, degeneration had been written, and syphilis was being much discussed, so it is possible, and it may be in there. But I personally don't see Bram Stoker as being that sophisticated a writer. If you look at all his other books, they're incredibly unsophisticated, even The Lair of the Lair of the White Worm, right, which was made into a film by Ken Russell. I mean, it's all about a woman who turns into a giant serpent who goes down into a well with all the sludge, and he wasn't even aware of the symbolism of that. And I mean, if you're not aware of the symbolism of that, then I think your head's in the clouds a little bit. But he just thought it was nasty. Yeah. This one. So sorry, I think the degeneration theme is in there actually, but not in a didactic way. It's just there is anxiety in the 1890s. What if the colonised hit back? And that's in there. And indeed, there is a casual anti-Semitism, as there is in most popular novels in the 1890s, where most of the merchants in the book are Jewish stereotypes. In fact, some people, this is a bit of a digression, but some people have seen Nosferatu as a possibly anti-Semitic film. And it was certainly, stills from it were taken up by the Nazis from the mid-1930s in articles about Jewishness. But I don't think the film itself in 1922 is like that at all. The man who plays Renfield was a well-known Jewish actor in Hebrew theatre. The writer of Nosferatu was a well-known Jewish writer, and Murnau was known to have to belong to a very wide Jewish circle of friends. I think it's coincidental that the makeup of Max Schreck as Nosferatu in some ways resembles the kind of stereotypes that were around in the 1920s. But I don't believe it's an anti-Semitic movie. But some people do, and some people think that Dracula also was anti-Semitic. It certainly has that casual anti-Semitism of popular novel. I mean, I defy you to find a detective story or an adventure story of the 1890s that isn't casually anti-Semitic. They just were. That was part of that kind of writing culture. But I don't think it was sort of conscious or intending to make a point. Sorry, that's a roundabout answer, but that's, yeah.
Any other questions? I'm just trying to... Oh, okay, fine. Can I finish with one then, Christopher, if that's okay? So you talked a lot, really persuasively, about the idea of vampires in literature as kind of culturally significant, you know, the idea of staging contemporary anxieties and so on. Would you say anything about the kind of literary quality of any particular works? And are there any particular works that you would sort of recommend to our audience, you know, to go away and read now? Are there any things that, are there any particular works that you would sort of...
with this one about
sorry. I took that as a given, really. You know, were there any, is there a handful of texts that you would recommend to people here to read?
Actually, well, of recent ones, I think Angela Carter's Lady of the House of Love in The Bloody Chamber is a fabulous vampire story, because it takes all the cliches and reworks them into a completely new realm. I mean, each word is hand-tooled. I mean, it's extraordinarily well written. I think that's it's about vampire stories as much as being a vampire story. And of course, it's a lady vampire, so it's also about vampires as a metaphor for dominance and dependence in human relations and so on. So I'd say that as a film, my favourite recent vampire film is Let the Right One In, a Swedish film, which is extraordinary. For those who haven't seen it, it's set in a school. It's about a family that moves to a housing estate outside Stockholm. There's a rather troubled little boy with a single mum who's bullied at school and develops his own fantasy life. And this child moves in next door, called Eli, a girl, and it turns out that she's a vampire. And they find how much they have in common, the little boy and the vampire, in their attitude to everybody else. And the vampire comes to the child's aid in sorting out the bullies. There's a wonderful moment. How long have you been a vampire? Says the little boy to the girl, and she says, hundreds of years, but I'm only 13. It's so sweet, and it's a beautiful film actually, based on this Swedish thing. So I thought that was great. I mean, I personally think the two 1970s novels, Salem's Lot by Stephen King and Interview with the Vampire by Anne Rice, they're not that well written, and Twilight is really badly written. The film, actually, it's an unusual example of the film being 50 times better than the book. I thought they really made something of it with the film, whereas I think, I mean, and Stephen King agrees with me. He said, you know, Stephanie Meyer can't write for shit, or some such phrase, some such elegant literary critical phrase. So I wouldn't recommend. What else of the written ones? I mean, well, if you want, if you want 19th century ones, they're all in there, in extract form or in actual form. I've got the whole of the Vampire and the whole of Byron's thing, and bits of the French stories at the same time, and so on, and a list of possibles at the end of recent books. I'm just trying to think of what. No, I think the Angela Carter is probably my favourite of contemporary, because she dates from a time when people are taking the Gothic seriously, and it's part of that, and it's about gender relations. I did a book launch in New York on Halloween last year, the last day of October, and everyone wanted to talk about vampires in relation to gender. You know, as a sort of the other, as a gay thing, or as a lesbian thing, or as a trans thing. And it was extraordinary, actually. Every single question, mind you, this was New York. I'm not saying it would have been the same in Arizona, but it was in New York. And it was extraordinary. So we all joined the Halloween march from Greenwich Village, which took place that night. And it's become a gay pride march. The two cultures have completely fused. It's a little bit like the Wizard of Oz, you know, that it's another world and becomes a sort of symbol of being gay in a mainstream community, and etc. And they find that very bad. And everyone was talking to me about a film that was made in the mid-30s called Dracula's Daughter, which, like a lot of horror films, I'll finish on this, but a lot of horror films deals with taboo subjects that mainstream films are incapable of dealing with direct, but they deal with them in a metaphorical way. I'll just give you some examples. Dracula's daughter, the Countess, who is Dracula's daughter, seduces a young artist model, a woman. It's the most lesbian scene in mainstream Hollywood cinema of the 1930s. It would never have appeared in a straightforward mainstream movie because it was a horror film nobody noticed. The Island of Dr. Moreau and the Murders in the Rue Morgue deal with bestiality. The Murders in the Rue Morgue, Eric the Ape gets up with all sorts of things in people's bedrooms. No mainstream Hollywood film would have dealt with bestiality, and certainly not with the kind of élan that film deals with it. The Tingler, a Vincent Price film of the 50s, contains the first LSD trip in cinema history. Nobody noticed. It's a horror movie. And so, like the literature, the films can carry all sorts of submerged themes, othering and all sorts of other things, taboos, that aren't confrontable within the mainstream of the culture. But as a metaphor, as a fairy tale, as a sideways step into fantasy, you can do it. It's like in Eastern Europe, in the Soviet era, where an awful lot of really exciting movies, Valerie and Her Week of Wonders, all these films which take a fairy tale approach, quite subversive, but because they're fairy tales, nobody cares. And I think that's true both of the literature. So when people started talking about othering in relation to vampire, I suddenly thought, yes, this is a tradition that can cope with the other in a way that mainstream literature can't, because of that sideways step. And I think that's actually important. I mean, while we're being serious, that's an important role for this kind of literature, and indeed for this kind of cinema. It deals, whether there's many taboos left that mainstream cinema can deal with, I don't know, but probably, I'm sure. But horror movies will continue to do it. That's part of their function. And in fact, some people argue that this goes back to the origins of art, the Lascaux caves, that, outside the cave there's bison and nasty beasties that are liable to get you, and all you've got is a catapult and a spear to deal with them. So you represent them on the wall as a way of coping with your fears. And once you've represented them, you can confront the real thing, reinforced by that image. Well, that's what horror movies do, in a way. So it may go back to the origin. No one knows why people painted those things on the wall. Was it magic? What was going on? Why did they? I think it was in order to make those scary things outside the cave bearable by turning them into art. I rest my case. Thank you very much.
So Christopher's anthology really is fantastic. Recommend it highly. Some of you may wish to acquire a copy now, and Christopher will be available to sign it at the desk. Thank you all very much for coming, and hope you look out for more events in the Festival of Ideas. Thank you very much.